The moment Nellie Quinn saw the stranger ride into Caldwell, Kansas on a mud-splattered roan horse in the spring of 1882, she felt something shift inside her chest like a door swinging open on a hinge she never knew was there. She was standing on the covered porch of Quinn's Mercantile, the store her father had built from raw lumber and ambition 12 years prior, sweeping dust from the planks with a long-handled broom and trying not to think about the conversation she'd had that morning with her father about marrying Dale Whitmore, the banker's son. Dale had good prospects, her father said. Dale had a future, a respectable name, clean fingernails, and the kind of polished manners that made men like Elias Quinn feel secure. Nellie had listened and smiled and nodded and felt absolutely nothing inside except a hollow kind of dread. Then the stranger rode in. He was tall in the saddle, the kind of tall that spoke not of arrogance but of easy confidence, the kind built by years of hard work under open sky. His hat was brown and battered at the brim, pulled low against the afternoon glare. He wore a canvas-work jacket over a faded blue shirt, and his boots were scuffed in the honest way of a man who actually used them. He brought the roan to a stop in front of Hayward's livery across the street, swung down with smooth economy, and ran a hand along the horse's neck with genuine tenderness before handing the reins to old Pete Hayward. Nellie did not realize she had stopped sweeping until the broom handle clattered against the porch rail. She picked it up quickly, heat rising in her cheeks, and looked away. She was 22 years old, and she was not the sort of woman who stared at strange men in the street. She was Nellie Quinn, daughter of Elias Quinn, one of the most respected merchants in Caldwell. She had been educated by a proper school teacher and could read French poetry and balance ledger books and make a pie crust that the women of the Methodist congregation still talked about. She had no business staring. She swept harder and thought about Dale Whitmore's clean fingernails. The stranger appeared at the Mercantile door 20 minutes later, hat in his hands, and that was when she saw his face properly. He was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair that curled slightly at the edges where the hat had pressed it down, a jaw that was square and honest, and eyes the color of deep river water on a cloudy day, a gray-blue that seemed to shift depending on the light. There was a thin scar along his left jaw, faint and old, and his cheekbones carried the weathered bronze of a man who spent his life outdoors. He looked at her directly, no sideways glancing, no shy fidgeting. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he finds genuinely interesting. "Afternoon," he said. His voice was low and warm, the kind that seemed to settle into the room rather than interrupt it. "I was hoping to purchase some provisions. Sugar, coffee, maybe some salt pork if you have it." "We have all of that," Nellie said, and she was relieved that her voice came out steady. She set the broom against the wall and moved behind the counter. "You passing through or staying on?" "Staying on," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that sounded decided, like a man who had thought about it and made up his mind. "I heard there was work at the Delaney cattle operation south of town. I'm going to ride out there tomorrow and see about a position. Frank Delaney always needs good hands in spring," she said, measuring coffee beans into the scale. "You have experience with cattle. Spent 5 years on drives out of Texas. Before that I worked a ranch in Colorado." He paused, watching her work. "My name is Henry Mercer." "Nellie Quinn," she said without looking up from the scale, because if she looked up she would smile, and she did not entirely trust herself at that moment. "Miss Quinn." He said her name like he was storing it somewhere careful. She wrapped his purchases in brown paper and twine, quoted him a fair price, and he paid without haggling, which she noticed because some men always haggled. He thanked her, settled his hat back on his head, and walked out into the afternoon light, and Nellie stood behind the counter for a long moment after the door closed, listening to the quiet. She told herself it was nothing. It was certainly nothing. She was expected to marry Dale Whitmore. Henry Mercer appeared again 3 days later, this time with a job at the Delaney Ranch confirmed, and a list of supplies he needed for the bunkhouse. He carried a folded piece of paper with Frank Delaney's handwriting on it, and laid it on the counter with the careful precision of a man who takes written instructions seriously. Nellie went through the list item by item, and Henry stood on the other side of the counter watching her with that same quiet directness. And somehow the exchange of flour sacks and lamp oil and box nails took nearly 45 minutes because they kept getting sidetracked into conversation. He told her about the cattle drives, about the long nights on the Kishom Trail with nothing overhead but stars and the low sound of 3,000 head of cattle breathing in the dark. He told her about a storm in the Texas Panhandle that he had ridden through at the age of 19 with 2 other cowboys, all 3 of them certain they were going to die, and how afterward one of the men had laughed for what seemed like 10 straight minutes and the other had cried, and Henry himself had simply sat in the wet grass and felt the most profoundly alive he had ever felt. Nellie told him about the store, about learning to read a balance sheet beside her father when she was 12, about how she could predict within 10 cents what the monthly receipts would be before her father tallied them. She told him she had read every book on the shelf of the Caldwell lending library at least twice, and that she had a particular fondness for adventure stories which made him laugh, a real laugh, open and unguarded. "What?" she said, smiling despite herself. "You just don't seem like someone who would spend their days behind a counter," he said. "And what do I seem like?" He thought about it seriously, leaning against the counter with his forearms resting on the wood. "Someone who would rather be moving," he said finally, "seeing things." She looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said quietly, "that is exactly right." He came back the following week on his afternoon off, and the week after that, and soon enough it was a regular thing, Henry Mercer appearing at Quinn's Mercantile on Saturday afternoons when the work at the Delaney Ranch allowed, and the 2 of them finding reasons to extend the transaction far beyond any reasonable commercial necessity. Nellie's friend Clara Webb noticed and said nothing, but she smiled in a particular way every time Henry's name came up, which was, Nellie realized with mild embarrassment, rather frequently. It was in late April that things shifted from pleasant conversation to something with more weight. Nellie had been alone in the store, her father out at the grain warehouse with the delivery men, when Henry came in looking slightly more purposeful than usual. He stood at the counter and said, without any preamble, "Miss Quinn, I would like to take you for a walk along the creek on Sunday afternoon, if you'd permit it." Nellie felt her heart do something extremely undignified. She kept her expression composed. "That is a very direct invitation, Mr. Mercer." "I'm a direct man," he said simply, "and I think you appreciate that more than you let on." She did appreciate it. She said yes. The walk along Medicine Lodge Creek on that Sunday afternoon in late April was one of the finest hours Nellie Quinn had ever spent. The cottonwood trees were coming into their new green, pale and trembling in the warm breeze, and the water ran clear and cold over smooth stones. Henry walked beside her at a comfortable distance, not crowding her, not performing any kind of courtly stiffness either, just being present in the easy way she had come to associate with him. He told her about his family, about growing up in Missouri on a small farm with his mother and his younger brother, about how his father had died of fever when Henry was 14 and left the 3 of them to manage however they could, about how he had gone west at 18 because there was more opportunity on the open range than on a worn-out Missouri farm. "Do you miss Missouri?" she asked. "I miss my mother," he said honestly. "She passed 2 years ago. My brother Thomas is still there, married, has a little boy." He paused, watching a red-tailed hawk circle high overhead. "But Missouri was never where I was meant to be. I knew that from the time I was a boy. There's something about the openness of this country that suits me." "It suits me too," she said, and then caught herself. "Not that I have seen much of it beyond Caldwell." "You'd like it," he said, with a confidence that seemed to assume a shared future without quite stating it, and she felt that door swing open again inside her chest. They turned back as the sun moved toward the western horizon, and the light went gold and long across the grass, and Henry offered her his arm for the last quarter mile, and she took it, and the warmth of his arm under her hand felt like something she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. It was that evening, sitting at the supper table with her father, that Nellie first felt the weight of the problem that was coming. Elias Quinn was a self-made man in every sense that phrase implies, with all the virtues and all the rigidities that tend to accompany it. He had come to Caldwell from Ohio with $40 and a determination that bordered on severity, and he had built his store and his reputation through nothing but discipline and shrewdness. He was not a cruel man. He loved his daughter genuinely and deeply. But his love had a quality to it that was also a kind of ownership, the love of a man who has built something and considers it his finest achievement and is therefore extremely particular about what becomes of it. He had decided that Dale Whitmore was the right match for Nellie, and when Elias Quinn decided something, it tended to stay decided. "You look flushed," he said over supper, watching her with his careful merchant's eyes. "I went for a walk," she said. "The sun was warm. Alone." She hesitated 1/2 second too long. "I walked with Henry Mercer. He works at the Delaney Ranch. He comes into the store on Saturdays." Her father set down his fork. It was a small, deliberate motion. Frank Delaney's hand. "Yes, Nellie." He said her name the way he said it when he was being patient in a way that was actually its own kind of warning. "You know Dale has been asking about calling on you formally. His father spoke to me just last week." "Dale Whitmore is very nice," Nellie said carefully. "He is also very dull." "Nice and steady is worth more than exciting and uncertain," her father said. "A ranch hand, Nellie. A man with nothing to his name but a horse and a bedroll." "He has more than that," she said, and she heard the small flare of feeling in her own voice. Her father looked at her for a long moment. "Be careful," he said, and picked his fork back up, and that was the end of the conversation, but Nellie understood perfectly well that it was not the end of the subject. She told Henry about it the following Saturday, not meaning to, but he had a way of drawing honest things out of her, so she found herself telling him while he leaned against the counter and listened with that focused stillness he had. "My father thinks you have no prospects," she said, watching his face for the wince that might reveal a wounded pride. There was no wince. There was a small, thoughtful silence, and then Henry said with absolute steadiness, "Your father is not wrong about where I stand right now. I have my wages, my horse, and a good name. That's the honest count. He wants me to marry Dale Whitmore, the banker's son." Henry nodded slowly. He straightened from the counter and looked at her with those river-gray eyes. "Is that what you want?" "No," she said quietly. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that she would carry with her for the rest of her life, something that settled into her like the first warm day after a long winter. He said it plainly, without drama, as if it were simply a fact he was reporting. "Then I will spend every day earning it." She looked at him. "Earning what?" "Your father's approval." He paused. "And whatever else you'd allow me to earn." Nellie was not a woman who cried easily, but she felt something sharp and warm move through her, and she had to look away at the window, at the bright street beyond, to collect herself. When she looked back, he was still watching her with that same steady patience. "He is a stubborn man," she said. "So am I," said Henry Mercer. It was not a small thing he was taking on. Elias Quinn had made his mind up about the sort of man who would be good enough for his daughter, and a working cowboy who had ridden in from nowhere with a battered hat and empty pockets was nowhere near that picture. Henry understood this in the clear-eyed way he understood most things, without self-pity or resentment, as a simple obstacle that required a plan. His plan, as far as Nellie could observe it taking shape over the weeks that followed, was neither showy nor dramatic. It was quiet and consistent and thorough, which was entirely in keeping with the man. He began by making himself useful, not in a fawning, calculated way, but in the natural way of a man who sees what needs doing and does it. He noticed that the porch steps of Quinn's Mercantile were beginning to rot, and said nothing to Nellie about it but spoke to her father directly, told him he'd be glad to replace them on his next free afternoon, and it wouldn't cost more than the lumber. Elias Quinn, who valued directness and practicality above most things, looked at him for a long moment, and said he'd think about it. Henry replaced the steps 2 Sundays later, and did it properly, no shortcuts, and Elias walked out and tested each one and said nothing except a brief nod, but it was a real nod, a nod that contained acknowledgement. He introduced himself formally to Elias at the first available opportunity, came into the store on a quiet Tuesday morning and said, "Mr. Quinn, I would like your permission to call on your daughter." He said it the way he said most things, looking the man straight in the face, no fidgeting. Elias had looked at him with the full weight of his considerable will and said, "You're Frank Delaney's hand." "I am," Henry said. "I'm also a man who works hard, keeps his word, and intends to build something in this country." "On a cowboy's wages," Elias said. "A man has to start somewhere," Henry said. Elias said he would consider it. He did not say no outright, which Henry told Nellie afterward with a kind of careful optimism, was better than a no. The spring passed into summer in that way that the Kansas plains do, hot and wide and brilliant, with thunderstorms that rolled in from the west in purple towers and soaked the earth in half an hour and left everything smelling of wet grass and lightning. Nellie and Henry saw each other on Saturdays and on Sunday afternoons when her father permitted it, which he did, grudgingly, having not said yes, but having not said no with sufficient finality to close the matter. What grew between them in those months was the kind of love that is built on attention, on the accumulation of small knowing things. Henry learned that Nellie always tucked a strand of hair behind her left ear when she was thinking hard about something. Nellie learned that Henry had a habit of rubbing the back of his neck when he was uncertain, which was rare enough to be significant when it appeared. He learned that she took her coffee black and preferred it scalding. She learned that he could not read a piece of music but had a precise memory for song lyrics and a singing voice that, on the single occasion she heard him singing quietly to himself while repairing the porch, was genuinely beautiful. She told him so, and he looked at her as if she had said something both surprising and secretly wonderful. "My mother used to say the same thing," he said. "She was right." He looked at her for a moment with something shifting in his face, something that went deeper than the ordinary warmth between them, and he said, very quietly, "You remind me of her sometimes, not in appearance, in the way you see things." It was one of the most intimate things anyone had ever said to her. That July, Frank Delaney offered Henry a foreman position after his head foreman broke his leg in a fall from a horse. It was not an enormous promotion in the grand sense of the word, but it was significant in the context of Caldwell, 1882, a meaningful step upward, with better wages and a degree of responsibility that spoke to a man's character. Henry told Nellie the news on a Saturday afternoon with the careful, restrained pleasure of a man who is not accustomed to allowing himself too much hope. "Foreman," she said, and she felt a surge of pride that surprised her with its intensity. "Henry, that's wonderful." "It means more pay," he said, "and it means Delaney trusts me with something. He'd be a fool not to trust you with something." He smiled at that, the full smile that she thought of as the rare one, the one that reached his eyes and softened everything in his face. "I'm going to tell your father," he said. "He will say you are still a ranch hand," she warned. "Then I will give him more to consider," Henry said. He told Elias that same week, formally and without any suggestion of boasting, simply laying out the facts. Elias listened, and Nellie, watching from the doorway of the back room under the pretense of sorting inventory, saw something flicker briefly in her father's face, something that might have been the very beginning of reassessment. But he said only that a foreman's position was not the same as owning land, and Henry agreed that it was not, and said he intended to change that. It was not an argument. It was a statement of intent, delivered calmly, and Elias had looked at him again with that weighing look and said nothing more, which Henry took as progress. The summer of 1882 in Caldwell was also the summer of the trouble with Holt's gang, which is a piece of the story that must be told because it was the piece that changed Elias Quinn's mind. in ways that his own stubbornness never would have allowed otherwise. Cole Holt was a man who operated in the borderlands of legality and had for years, riding in and out of Caldwell and the surrounding territory with 3 or 4 companions who shared his flexibility of conscience. They were not the dramatic outlaws of dime novels, not train robbers or bank thieves of the spectacular variety, but men who stole cattle and horses and goods, and occasionally committed crimes of opportunistic violence when they felt they could get away with it. The sheriff of Caldwell, a man named Beckett, was competent but stretched thin across a county that was too large for his resources. In August, 2 of Holt's men came into Quinn's mercantile on a Wednesday morning when Elias was at the bank, and only Nellie and their stock boy, a 14-year-old named Thomas Pryor, were present. They wanted provisions and they wanted them without payment, and they communicated this wish with a casualness that was designed to make the threat feel unstated and therefore unanswerable. Nellie was frightened, but she was not the kind of woman who showed her fear in ways that gave power to the person causing it. She stood behind the counter and looked at the 2 men, who were unshaven and smelled of horses and whiskey, and she said calmly that she would need to see payment. The taller of the 2 men put his hand on the handle of his revolver. He did not draw it. He just rested his hand there and smiled and said payment was not going to be the arrangement today. Nellie was considering her options with the rapid clarity that danger sometimes produces when Henry walked in through the front door, stopping to hold it for a woman with a baby carriage on the way out, which was such an ordinary act of courtesy that it created a half-second of incongruity before the situation arranged itself around him. He took in the scene in a single glance. His face did not change much, but everything in his posture did, that easy looseness becoming something else, something alert and absolutely still. "Afternoon," he said to the room in general, moving to the counter as if he intended to make a purchase, positioning himself between the 2 men and Nellie without making a production of it. "Friend of yours," said the tall man to Nellie. "He works at the Delaney Ranch," she said, which told Henry they had been in Caldwell long enough to know things. Henry looked at the tall man. "I think there's been some misunderstanding about payment," he said, in the same pleasant, level voice he used for ordinary conversation. "These are good people and they run an honest business. You'll want to settle up before you leave." What happened next was a test of something that is not so much physical as psychological, a contest of will between 2 men assessing each other across a small space. Henry did not draw his gun. He did not reach for it or gesture toward it. He simply stood there with a steadiness that communicated something the tall man read correctly, which was that this particular encounter was going to go badly for him if it went the way he was considering. The tall man held his ground for a moment that stretched thinly, and then he reached slowly into his coat and produced a handful of coins and set them on the counter. "Friendly establishment after all," he said, and he and his companion took their goods and left. Nellie let out a slow, controlled breath. Thomas Pryor behind her made a sound that was half laugh and half sob. Henry looked at her. "You all right?" "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "Yes." He looked at the coins on the counter. "Not quite enough for what they took." "Near enough," she said, and then, because she was Nellie Quinn and not a woman who performed helplessness, she said, "Thank you, Henry." That was well done. He nodded once, and that was all, and she loved him precisely for the absence of bravado in it. What she did not know until several days later was that Henry had gone to Sheriff Beckett directly afterward and given detailed descriptions of both men and their horses. And that information, combined with reports from 2 other establishments they had visited that day, was what led to Holt's men being picked up 10 days later in a town 40 miles south. She found out because the sheriff mentioned it to her father when Elias stopped into the jail to report the incident, and Beckett said, "Your daughter's friend Mercer gave me the information that helped close this up." Elias came home that evening and sat in his chair by the window for a long time without speaking. Nellie watched him from across the room over the book she was pretending to read, Finally he said, "That cowboy of yours." "Henry," she said. "He went to Breckett." "I didn't know that until recently," she said honestly. Elias was quiet again. "Then he didn't mention it to you?" "No." Her father turned this over visibly. He was a man who understood the value of a thing done quietly, without advertising. It was how he had always operated himself. "He's got nerve," he said finally, which from Elias Quinn was not a small concession. "He does," Nellie agreed. More silence. Then Elias said, "Tell him to come for supper Sunday." Nellie set her book down. She was careful not to let her expression become too much of anything. "I will tell him." The Sunday supper was not a comfortable event, but it was an honest one, which was perhaps better. Henry arrived exactly when he said he would, in his cleanest shirt, hat in hand, and he shook Elias Quinn's hand with a grip that Elias seemed to measure and find adequate. They sat at the table, and Nellie served the meal she had been cooking since early morning: roast chicken and potatoes and green beans from the kitchen garden, and a pie that she had made with the last of the summer peaches, and the three of them talked. Elias asked Henry direct questions about his plans, about his income, about his intentions regarding a future. Henry answered all of them without evasion or embellishment. He told Elias exactly what he earned as foreman, which was modest but not negligible. He told him he had been saving with the specific intention of eventually purchasing land. He told him Frank Delaney had offered him a share arrangement if he stayed on for 3 years and the ranch expanded as projected, which would give him equity without requiring him to have capital he did not yet possess. "Delaney offered you a share," Elias said, and the surprise was real. "He mentioned it last month," Henry said. "I told him I needed to think about whether Caldwell was where I intended to stay." He paused, and his eyes moved briefly to Nellie, who was looking at her plate with the expression of a woman trying very hard to appear calm. "I've decided it is." Elias looked at him for a long moment over the rim of his coffee cup. Then he looked at his daughter. Then he looked back at Henry. "You understand," he said, "that I am not a man who changes his mind easily." "I respect that," Henry said. "And you understand that what I want for Nellie is security, a real life, not wandering." "I understand that completely," Henry said, "and I would tell you that wandering is behind me. I found what I was looking for." Elias set his cup down and was quiet for what felt to Nellie like an extremely long time. Then he said, "You may call on her formally. We will see how things develop." Nellie kept her expression composed. Under the table, her hands were clasped so tightly together her knuckles had gone white. "Thank you, sir," Henry said, and his voice was steady, but Nellie knew him well enough now to hear the depth of feeling underneath it. After supper, while Elias went to the front porch to smoke his pipe as was his custom, Henry helped Nellie carry dishes to the kitchen, which was not what men generally did in 1882, and which she noticed and said nothing about except to look at him with a small, quiet smile. They stood in the kitchen with the warm smell of the meal around them and the sound of the evening crickets starting up outside, and Henry said, very quietly, "Your father is a good man." "He is," she said. "Stubborn but good. I think we understand each other better than he's letting on," Henry said. She looked up at him. He was standing very close in the small kitchen, closer than he usually stood, and she could see the particular gray-blue of his eyes in the lamp light and the way the evening had softened the lines around them. "Henry," she said, "yes. When you said you would spend every day earning it, did you mean only my father's approval?" He looked at her for a moment, and something shifted in his face, that deeper thing she had seen before. "No," he said quietly. "I meant yours." "You already have mine," she said, and the simplicity of saying it aloud after so many months of carrying it was extraordinary, like setting down a weight she had grown so accustomed to that she had stopped noticing it. He reached out and took her hand carefully, his thumb resting against her knuckles, and they stood like that in the warm kitchen for a moment that felt complete and whole and separate from the rest of time. "I should go," he said softly, "before your father comes back in." "Yes," she agreed, and neither of them moved for another few seconds. He called on her formally through that autumn. coming on Saturday and Sunday afternoons to the Quinn house, sitting in the parlor with Elias present for a suitable portion of the time, and then being permitted to walk with Nellie in the garden or along the street while her father returned to his reading. The courtship had a formal quality that was required by the period and the circumstances, but within it, between the two of them, it was anything but formal. They talked about everything. They talked about books and about cattle drives and about what Nellie imagined the Pacific Ocean looked like, neither of them having seen it, and about what kind of house Henry intended to build when he had land, and about what kind of life they both wanted. And the conversations had the quality of two people discovering, with increasing wonder, that what they want is the same thing. October brought a change in the weather and in Dale Whitmore, who apparently felt that time was running out and became abruptly more aggressive in his intentions. He appeared at the Mercantile 3 times in a single week, each time with a formal courtesy that felt to Nellie like a net being cast, and the third time he asked her plainly if she would consider his attentions more seriously, as his father had been speaking to her father, and he understood there was a possibility of an arrangement. Nellie looked at Dale Whitmore, who was neat and pleasant and completely without spark, and said, as kindly as she was able, that she was already being called upon by someone else, and she did not think she would be changing that. Dale blinked. "The cowboy," he said, and the way he said it carried a very small dismissiveness that nonetheless landed clearly. "Henry Mercer," she said. "Yes." Dale looked at her for a moment with something that was almost genuine surprise, as if he had not quite believed until this moment that she was serious. "Your father," he began. "My father has permitted it," she said. Dale nodded slowly, and to his credit, he accepted it without making a scene, and said he hoped she would be happy, and she thanked him, and he left, and Nellie felt an enormous and slightly shameful relief. She told Henry that evening, and he listened without gloating, which she appreciated. What he said instead was, "I should speak to your father soon about something more formal." He said it looking at the middle distance, the way he looked when he was working out something he had already mostly decided. "If that is something you'd consider." "You're asking me if I'd consider a proposal before you've made one," she said. He looked at her then with a faint smile and a complete absence of embarrassment. "I suppose I am. I prefer to know the landscape before I ride into it." "The landscape," she said, "is entirely favorable." He smiled fully then, the rare one, and she felt it like sunlight. He spoke to Elias Quinn on a Tuesday evening in late October, going to the man's house without Nellie present, requesting a private word. Nellie knew because Henry told her afterward, giving her a careful and honest account of the conversation that she thought was one of the things she loved most about him, the way he did not simplify or soften the truth. Elias had heard him out, Henry said. Heard the whole thing, the request to marry Nellie, the accounting of his current situation and his prospects, the share arrangement with Delaney, the savings he had accumulated. Elias had been quiet for a long time. Then he had said, "I told you I don't change my mind easily." "Yes, sir," Henry had said. "I haven't changed it," Elias said. "I've added to it. There's a difference." He had looked out the window. "You've done what you said you'd do. I'm a man who pays attention to that." Another long pause. "You have my blessing. Don't make me regret it." "I won't," Henry had said. "I give you my word." Nellie listened to this account sitting very still on the porch bench beside Henry in the cool October evening with the smell of dry leaves and wood smoke in the air, and when he finished she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He told you not to make him regret it." "He did." "That is my father saying he loves you," she said. Henry turned to look at her. "Is it?" "It is the closest he comes to it," she said. "He only says things like that to people he's decided to trust." Henry was quiet for a moment, and she saw something move through his face, something she could not quite name, a kind of gratitude that ran deeper than the surface. "He worked hard for you," Henry said. "I understand why he was careful." "He did," she said, "and so did you." Henry reached into his jacket pocket and produced a ring, small and simple, a gold band with a single small garnet, deep red, that caught the last of the evening light. He had bought it in Wichita on his last supply run, he told her, from a jeweler there, and he had been carrying it for 3 weeks while he worked up the courage to speak to her father. He held it out to her on his palm and said, "Nellie Quinn, I would like to spend the rest of my life being the man who was good enough for you. Will you marry me?" She looked at the ring in his hand and then at his face, at those river-gray eyes that had looked at her straight from the first moment, that had never pretended to be anything they were not. And she said, yes, clearly and without hesitation, because there had never been any real uncertainty, only the obstacles that had needed clearing, and they were cleared now, and what remained was this. He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it, that small red stone in the lamplight of the porch, and then she looked at him, and he looked at her, and there was a long, quiet moment that contained everything. Then he took her hand and held it, and they sat on the porch together in the cool evening, while the stars came out over the Kansas plain, enormous and brilliant, the kind of sky that only exists where there is no city to dim it. And Nellie thought that she had never in her life felt so perfectly, completely in the right place. They were married in December of 1882, in the Methodist church in Caldwell on a cold, bright Saturday with a sky so blue it looked painted. Nellie wore her mother's white dress, let out slightly at the waist and taken in at the shoulders to fit her better, with a cream-colored ribbon in her dark hair. Henry wore a new black coat and his good boots, and the hat he had bought in Wichita when he bought the ring, which was less battered than his working hat but had the same honest quality to it. He stood at the front of the church and watched her walk down the aisle on her father's arm, and what was on his face in that moment was something so unguarded and complete that Clara Webb, standing in the third pew, had to press her handkerchief against her mouth. Elias Quinn walked his daughter to Henry Mercer and put her hand in the cowboy's hand, and when he stepped back there was something in the older man's face that might, if you were reading him charitably and had known him long enough to know where to look, have been called happiness. The Reverend performed the ceremony in a clear voice that carried to the back of the full church, because most of Caldwell had come, because in a town of that size in 1882, a wedding was the kind of event that brought everyone out, and because people had watched the unfolding of this particular story with considerable interest over the preceding months. When the Reverend asked Henry if he took this woman, Henry said, "I do," with the same straightforward certainty he brought to everything. And when he asked Nellie if she took this man, she said, "I do," with a firmness that made several people in the congregation smile, because it sounded less like a ceremony and more like a declaration. Henry kissed her in the careful, proper way of a public ceremony, but she felt in it everything that it would be in private, all the warmth and attention and steady feeling that she had come to understand was his particular kind of love. They celebrated afterward in the Quinn family home, which Elias had opened for the occasion, with food brought by half the women of the town and music provided by 2 fiddle players and a man with an accordion, and there was dancing that went until past midnight on the cold December floors. Henry danced with Nellie 3 times before propriety required him to dance with other people, and each time he did, he danced with the same focused attention he gave to everything, unhurried, steady, his hand at the small of her back warm through the fabric of the dress. Late in the evening, Elias found himself standing beside Henry at the edge of the room, both of them watching Nellie dance with Clara Webb in the absence of available partners, the 2 women laughing at something, that particular delighted laugh that Nellie had when something struck her as genuinely funny, head slightly back, completely unself-conscious. "She laughs more lately," Elias said, without looking at Henry. Henry watched Nellie. "I hope that's my doing," he said. Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said gruffly and almost inaudibly, "It is." He cleared his throat. "You're a good man, Mercer. I was slow to see it, that's on me." Henry looked at him then directly with that steady gray gaze. "You were careful with something precious," he said. "I can't fault you for that." Elias looked at him for a moment, and then he nodded once, the real nod, the nod of genuine acceptance, and he went to get himself more punch. And Henry watched Nellie laughing across the room and felt something in his chest that was so full it was almost difficult to contain. They moved into a rented house on the south edge of Caldwell to begin with, a small but solid place, 2 rooms downstairs and 1 up, with a good stove and a garden plot behind it that Nellie immediately began planning improvements to, even in December, drawing layouts on paper at the kitchen table in the evenings, while Henry read the Wichita newspaper or worked on the account books he kept for the Delaney Ranch. Their life together had the quality of 2 people who had thought carefully about what they wanted and were now in the daily business of building it. They were not a perfect couple in the sense of a couple without disagreements, because Nellie had opinions and expressed them, and Henry had a stubbornness that matched her father's in certain respects, and there were evenings when the 2 of them sat on opposite sides of a conversation with a particular silence between them. But they had a shared understanding, arrived at without ever quite stating it explicitly, that they were on the same side. That disagreement was something to be worked through rather than a sign of wrongness, and this made those occasions shorter and less damaging than they might otherwise have been. What they were mostly was happy. Genuinely, daily, practical happy, the kind that does not require grand gestures to sustain itself because it is built into the ordinary structure of things. Henry brought her wildflowers from the field on his way home from the ranch when they were in season, not as a romantic performance, but because he noticed them and thought of her. Nellie saved newspaper articles she thought would interest him and set them by his coffee cup in the morning. He fixed things around the house without being asked. She had supper ready when he came in exhausted from the ranch, and also sometimes left it on the stove, and went for her own walk in the afternoon because she needed the air. And he understood this completely, and never made her account for it. Spring came to Caldwell in 1883 with a particular abundance, warm rain, and a wildflower bloom across the prairie that was remarkable even by Kansas standards, sheets of color rolling out to the horizon. Nellie stood at the kitchen window one morning in April looking at it, the sun just coming over the edge of the world and the light going gold and pink across the grass, and Henry came up behind her and put his arms around her, and they stood together watching the light move, and she felt so profoundly, specifically glad that she almost could not account for it. It was in early summer of 1883 that Frank Delaney made the share arrangement official, drawing up a legal document with a lawyer from Wichita, giving Henry a 10% equity stake in the operation in exchange for his continued service as foreman and a modest financial contribution from his savings. Henry came home that evening with the signed paper and laid it on the kitchen table and stood back and looked at it with a kind of quiet wonder. Nellie read it through carefully. Then she looked up at him. "This is land," she said. "This is a start on land." "It's a start," he said. She stood up and went to him and put her arms around his neck and held on, and he held her back tightly, his face against her hair, and neither of them said anything for a while because nothing needed saying. By the fall of 1883, Nellie knew she was expecting their first child. She told Henry on a Saturday evening in September, sitting across the kitchen table from him, watching his face carefully as the information landed. He went very still for a moment, the way he went still when something genuinely mattered. Then he looked at her with something in his face that she had never seen before, something wholly new, a wonder and a weight and a joy so large it seemed to be looking for somewhere to go. "Are you sure?" he said. "I am sure," she said. He got up from the table and came around to her and knelt beside her chair, which was not a position that came naturally to Henry Mercer, and took both her hands. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you feeling all right?" "I'm perfectly well," she said, smiling. "I feel wonderful." He pressed his forehead to her hands briefly, a gesture so private and so unlike his usual composure that she felt tears prick at her eyes. Then he looked up at her with that full smile, the rare one, made less rare now than it had been a year ago but still precious every time. "A family," he said. "A family," she agreed. She told her father the following Sunday, and Elias Quinn, who did not make displays of feeling as a rule, reached across the kitchen table and gripped her hand and held it firmly for a moment, his jaw tight in the way it went when he was keeping something in. "Your mother would have been glad," he said. Nellie's mother had died when Nellie was 11. It was not something her father spoke about often. The fact that he said it now told her everything about the depth of what he was feeling. "I think she would have liked Henry," Nellie said. Elias was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I think she would have liked him very much." The winter of 1883 passed in the particular way of a winter when you are waiting for something, slowly and with great variety of feeling. Nellie read and sewed, and managed the household, and endured the months with grace and occasional impatience. Henry was attentive to a degree that she sometimes had to tell him to temper, because she was capable and strong and did not require hovering, which she said firmly, and with affection, and he accepted, pulling back slightly. But she would catch him watching her from across the room, sometimes with a careful attention that was its own kind of love. She also, in those months, began helping her father at the mercantile 2 mornings a week again, which Henry supported without reservation, because he understood that sitting still did not suit her, and that her mind needed occupation. She reorganized the inventory system and introduced a new ledger method that reduced her father's accounting time by 1/3. Elias, watching her implement it, said, "You always were the better bookkeeper." "I know," she said pleasantly. He laughed, which was relatively rare for Elias Quinn, a real laugh, and she thought that perhaps Henry's presence in their lives had done something to her father too, had opened some valve somewhere in the careful structure of the man. He smiled more easily these days. He had come to the Mercer house for supper twice in the last month, and sat at their table and talked for hours, not only with Henry about business and the ranch and the cattle market, but with Nellie about books and the town and her garden, and it reminded her of times when she was young, before her mother died and her father had closed himself around the grief. Their son was born in the first week of March, 1884, on a cold, clear night with stars all the way to the horizon and a wind that sang in the chimney. Henry was present for the whole of it, which was not entirely common in that era but which he absolutely refused to forgo, sitting with Nellie's hand in his through the long hours, steady and present, speaking quietly to her when it helped and being silent when quiet was what was needed. He was, as Clara Webb said afterward with frank admiration, a remarkable man for a crisis. The boy came out squalling with a full head of dark hair and Henry's gray-blue eyes and Nellie's set of the jaw. And when Henry held him for the first time, standing in the lamplight of their bedroom with the infant wrapped in flannel and the wind still singing outside, there was something on his face that Nellie thought she would carry with her always. The image of it, that absolute tenderness on the face of a man who had been built by hard years and hard weather, and who was, in this moment, entirely undone. "What do we call him?" Nellie said from the pillow, exhausted and warm and full of something large enough that it needed a new name. "James," Henry said, without hesitation. It had been his grandfather's name, he had told her once, a man he had known only briefly and admired enormously. "James Mercer," she said. "It's a good name." "It's a good boy," Henry said, looking down at the infant who had stopped crying and was looking up at his father with the unfocused intensity of the newly arrived. "He's got your look about him. He's got your eyes," she said. "Then he'll see things clearly," Henry said, and smiled, and she loved him so much in that moment it was like a physical ache. Elias Quinn came the following morning and stood in the doorway of the bedroom with his hat in his hands and looked at his grandson, and his face did the thing it had done when Nellie told him about the pregnancy, went tight and controlled to keep something in, and then he looked at Nellie in the bed and said gruffly, "He's a fine boy, Nellie." "He is," she agreed. He came in and sat beside the bed and held the infant with surprising confidence, because Elias Quinn had held a baby before, had held Nellie herself in this way 32 years ago, and something in the holding of James Mercer seemed to return him to that time and that feeling, and his face in those minutes was as open as Nellie had ever seen it. Henry stood in the doorway and watched his father-in-law hold his son, and the look he and Nellie exchanged over Elia's head was a whole conversation, complete and wordless. Life in Caldwell in 1884 and into 1885 had the quality of a good river, strong and moving, purposeful. Henry's work at the Delaney Ranch continued to prosper. Frank Delaney, who was in his 50s and had no children of his own, had come to rely on Henry not only for the daily management of the operation, but as a sounding board for larger decisions, and their professional relationship had grown into something that contained genuine respect on both sides. The cattle market was strong, the ranch was expanding, and Henry's equity share was becoming something of real value. In the spring of 1885, Frank Delaney fell ill with a chest complaint that the Caldwell doctor took seriously enough to recommend he reduce his activity, and he offered Henry an expanded arrangement, increasing his share to 25% in exchange for taking over a larger portion of the decision-making. Henry came home with this news and told Nellie at the kitchen table while James, who was a year old and already pulling himself upright on every available surface, and regarding the world with a determination that was entirely recognizable, attempted to navigate the kitchen floor. Nellie listened to the details of the arrangement carefully, asking questions that Henry answered fully, the two of them going over it as partners, which was what they were. When they had been through it thoroughly, she said, "Take it." He had already decided to take it, but the fact that she said it clearly mattered. "You think so?" "Henry," she said, with the particular patience she reserved for moments when he was hedging, "you have been running that ranch for 2 years. Delaney knows it. This is simply putting an honest number on what already exists." He smiled. "When you say it like that." "I always say it like that," she said. "You're the one who needs a moment to catch up." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "What would I do without you telling me what I already know?" "Less efficiently," she said, and he laughed, and James, taking this as encouragement, let go of the kitchen chair he had been using for support and took 4 independent steps before sitting down heavily on the floor and looking extremely surprised. Nellie and Henry both looked at each other, and then at their son on the floor, and then at each other again, and Henry got up from the table and went to James and crouched down to his level and said, "That was it. That was the beginning of everything," in a voice so quiet and so full of feeling that Nellie looked away at the window for a moment to compose herself. The year 1885 brought one more thing that completed the shape of what they were building. Frank Delaney, whose health had improved somewhat under his reduced schedule, made an offer that Henry had not anticipated. He was considering selling a portion of the land at the eastern edge of his property, 40 acres that bordered the creek, good grass and water, and he was offering it to Henry first, below the market rate, because he trusted him and wanted it to go to someone who would work it properly. 40 acres was not an empire, but it was land, real land, and with the creek running through it and the grass that grew there and the possibilities of it, Henry Mercer stood on it one Sunday afternoon in October and turned a slow circle with his boots in the deep grass, and his face turned up to the enormous Kansas sky, and felt something settle in him so completely that it was almost a sound, like a door closing on everything that had come before. He brought Nellie out the following Sunday, riding in the wagon with James on her lap bundled in his winter coat, the boy's dark hair blowing in the cold October wind, and his gray-blue eyes wide with the interest of new landscape. Henry helped her down from the wagon, and they stood together at the edge of the property looking east to where the cottonwoods marked the line of the creek, and the sky above them was that particular autumn blue that seems to belong only to the plains, deep and endless and very still. "This is ours," Henry said. Nellie stood beside him with their son on her hip and her husband's arm around her shoulders, and looked at 40 acres of Kansas in the autumn light. She thought about the morning she had been sweeping the porch of her father's mercantile, and a stranger had ridden into town on a mud-splattered roan horse. She thought about everything that had come between that moment and this one, the conversations and the courage and the patience and the work and the love that had accumulated over 3 years into this life she was standing inside. She thought about Henry's face when he held their son for the first time, and her father's face when he said, "You have my blessing," and the ring with the small red garnet that still sat on her finger every single day, the lamp light catching the stone. "It's ours," she said. He pulled her a little closer, and she leaned into him, and James reached up and grabbed a fistful of Henry's jacket with the determined grip of a boy who has decided where he belongs. They began building the house in the spring of 1886. Henry and 3 other men from the Delaney operation laid the foundation and framed it up over 6 weeks of hard work, and Nellie managed the construction as if she were managing the mercantile ledgers, systematic and organized, with a clear picture in her mind of what the finished thing would be. The house was not large, but it was well made, 2 stories, with a porch on the front that looked west toward the town and a porch on the back that looked east toward the creek, and large windows that let in the Kansas light, and a kitchen that was bigger than strictly necessary because Nellie believed a kitchen should be a room where people wanted to gather. Nellie Quinn came out every Sunday that spring to observe the progress, which became a habit that became something Henry quietly arranged to make possible, ensuring there was always something interesting to show the older man when he arrived, some new development in the construction worth examining. Elias and Henry fell into a pattern of walking the property together on these Sundays, Elias asking questions in his careful merchant's way, and Henry answering them with the patient thoroughness of a man who has thought all of this through. Nellie watched them from a distance sometimes, the 2 men walking the grass together, her father's hat and Henry's hat, the older man's careful measured steps and her husband's longer easy stride, and the sight of them had a particular completeness to it that she found deeply, quietly satisfying. James turned to that march and was everywhere at once, the particular everywhere of a 2-year-old boy on open ground, endlessly interested in rocks and dirt, and the horses in the small paddock Henry had built, fearless in the way of children who have not yet accumulated any reasons for fear. Henry spent his evenings with the boy in a way that was clearly one of the central pleasures of his life, reading to him and showing him how things worked and sitting in the grass with him at the end of the day watching whatever James was watching, a beetle or a cloud or a horse at the fence, with the same focused attention he had brought to everything since the first moment Nellie had known him. She thought sometimes, watching this, about what kind of father she had imagined for her children when she was a girl, and whether she had imagined correctly, and she decided that she had not imagined correctly because she had not had sufficient material to work with. She had not known there could be something like this. They moved into the house in July of 1886, carrying their things from the rented house in Caldwell in the wagon over 3 trips. Nellie set the last box down in the kitchen and stood in the middle of the room and looked around at the walls Henry had built, and the windows she had chosen, and the floor that still smelled of new wood and the light coming in from the east, and James stood beside her holding her hand with 2 fingers in the careful way he had learned to be gentle with her ring, and Henry stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and watched her face. "Well," he said. She looked at him. "Home," she said simply. He crossed the room and put his arms around her from behind, the way he had stood at the kitchen window that April morning watching the wildflower light, and James grabbed both their legs and said "home," in the way of a 2-year-old who has heard a word and identified it as important, and Nellie laughed, a full laugh, the kind that Clara Webb would have recognized, and Henry put his face against her hair and held on. The seasons turned in that house in the particular unhurried way of a life that is well made. Henry's arrangement with the Delaney ranch deepened as Frank's health improved, and the 2 men found a working rhythm that suited them both. Nellie returned more formally to helping at the mercantile 3 mornings a week after the house was established, and she and her father fell back into the easy working partnership they had always had, moving around each other behind the counter with the fluency of long familiarity. And Elias taught her the aspects of the supply negotiation she had not previously managed, and she introduced him to the account-keeping methods she had read about in a business journal. And between the two of them, they expanded the store's trade by an appreciable margin over the following year. Elias Quinn, at 60, was a man in the process of gradual softening, and it was visible to anyone who had known him long enough. He laughed at meals now. He told stories about his early years in Ohio that he had not told for decades. He came to the Mercer house for supper every Sunday and arrived with small things for James: a new top, a carved horse, a piece of candy wrapped in paper, presented with the careful casualness of a man who has strong feelings but is still learning how to show them in the small, easy ways that make a family. James adored him. The boy had a gift for people, open and curious and without caution, and he attached himself to his grandfather with a completeness that was visibly good for both of them. Elias would sit in the big chair on the back porch with the boy on his lap reading to him, his voice going lower and softer than it ever did in the store or on the street. And sometimes Nellie would stand at the back door for a moment just to hear it, her father's voice doing that thing it only did for James, and she would feel a complex, layered gratitude that she could not have fully articulated. In the autumn of 1887, Nellie told Henry she was expecting again. He received this news with the particular stillness he had shown the first time, but this time followed more quickly by the full smile, and he pulled her close and held her and said into her hair, "James is going to have a brother or sister." "He will be insufferably excited," she said. "He'll be wonderful about it," Henry said, with the confidence of a man who has watched his son carefully enough to know him. He was right. When they told James, who was 3.5 and had a vocabulary that consistently amazed adults, he considered the information seriously for a moment and then said, "Will the baby like horses?" "Very probably," Henry said. James nodded, apparently satisfied. "Good," he said. This pregnancy moved differently than the first, which the doctor said was entirely normal and unremarkable, but which Nellie found interesting, the variations in how the body carries different lives. She was less tired and more irritable in the early months, and Henry navigated this with a diplomatic skill that she appreciated and told him so, and he said that he had dealt with more difficult cattle, and she told him that was the most unromantic thing he had ever said, and they both laughed. The child was born in March of 1888, another cold, clear night, another set of stars. It was a girl this time, born with Nellie's dark hair and Henry's eyes, and a temper that announced itself in the first minute and did not subsequently diminish. They named her Me, after Henry's mother. James was present for the first introduction of his sister to the household, standing beside his father in the doorway of the bedroom, very serious, his dark hair pushed back behind his ears in the way he had when he was concentrating. Henry crouched beside him so they were at the same level. "She's very small," James observed. "You were smaller," Henry said. James seemed to find this difficult to believe. He looked at me, who was wrapped in flannel and looking at the ceiling with the profound interest of someone who has just arrived in an entirely new world. "Hello, Me," James said, with the careful courtesy of a boy who has been taught that people deserve proper greetings. Me moved her hand in a way that might have been purposeful or might have been reflexive, and James looked at his father with enormous eyes. "She heard me," he whispered. "She did," Henry said. James stood a little straighter, with the visible weight of new responsibility settling on 3-year-old shoulders. Nellie, watching from the bed, felt something so warm and complete and specific that it required no name. Henry looked up at her over James's head, and they had the wordless conversation again, the whole one, the one that said everything. Elias Quinn, when he was brought Me for the first time, sat in the chair by Nellie's bed and held his granddaughter and was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Me, that was Henry's mother's name." "Yes," Nellie said. He looked at the baby for another long moment. "Good name," he said, which from Elias was an acknowledgment that meant considerably more than the words themselves. The life at the Mercer place in the years that followed was a full one, the kind that requires a great many hands and generates a great many memories. The 40 acres produced well. Henry added a proper barn in 1888 and a chicken house in 1889, and expanded the garden that Nellie managed with the same systematic attention she brought to everything. He kept 3 horses and a small number of cattle, and maintained his arrangement with the Delaney operation, which had grown substantially, and in 1889 offered him a 40% stake when Frank Delaney, whose health had continued to present complications, began thinking about the longer term. Henry brought this offer to the kitchen table in the same way he had brought all the previous ones, laying it out fully and honestly, and Nellie went through it with him in the same way she always had, asking questions, working through the implications, and at the end she said, "This is more than you expected to have at 33. "Considerably more," he said. "Good," she said. "You earned it." He looked at her across the kitchen table. James was asleep upstairs, and me was in the cradle beside the stove, and the lamp was burning low, and the autumn wind was moving around the corners of the house he had built, and Henry Mercer looked at his wife across the table and felt the fullness of everything he had not dared to fully imagine that day he rode into Caldwell on a mud-splattered roan horse. "I had help," he said. She smiled. "A little," she allowed. He reached across the table and took her hand, the one with the small garnet ring, and turned it over in his palm and looked at it for a moment. 3 years of kitchen work and garden work and children and building and living had left their marks on her hands, but the ring was exactly as it had been the night he put it on her finger on the porch of her father's house in October of 1882. "I meant what I said that day in the store," he said. "The day I said I would spend every day earning it." She looked at him. "Henry, I need you to know I still mean it," he said. "I will keep meaning it, every day I have." She turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his. "And I need you to know," she said quietly, "that you have never for a single day fallen short of it." They stayed like that at the kitchen table, with the lamp burning between them and the children sleeping above, with the house around them and the land outside and the wide Kansas sky going dark and huge and full of stars overhead, and the world was large and imperfect and entirely, completely theirs. Elias Quinn came for Christmas of 1889 and stayed 4 days, which was the longest he had stayed at the Mercer place, and the house was full of the noise and warmth of it. James at 5 years old full of elaborate opinions about everything, and me at nearly 2 years old full of the particular fierce energy that had characterized her from the beginning, climbing everything she could reach, and regarding anything she could not reach with an expression of frank challenge that made Henry and Nellie look at each other, with the helpless amusement of parents who recognize their own qualities recombined in a more concentrated form. On the last evening of the visit, after the children were in bed and the dishes were done, Elias sat by the fire in the front room with a glass of whiskey, and Henry sat across from him, and Nellie sat beside her husband, and the 3 of them talked in the comfortable way that they had arrived at, the way that had taken most of a decade to build and was now as natural as breathing. At some point in the evening, Elias looked at the fire and said, without particular preamble, "When you first came into the store, I thought you were a drifter." Henry said nothing, just waited, because he had learned that Elias needed space to say things in his own time. "I was wrong," Elias said. He looked up. "I want to say it plainly. I was wrong about you, and I was slow about it, and I regret the slowness." Henry looked at the older man steadily. "You were careful," he said. "That was all." "Don't be charitable about it," Elias said, with the directness that was the thing Henry had always respected most about him. "I had a picture in my head of what was acceptable, and you didn't fit the picture, and I held to the picture longer than the evidence warranted. That was pride, not caution." Henry was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You gave me the chance to show you something different. That's all I needed." Elias looked at him. "I know," he said, "and you showed it." He paused. "She's happy, Mercer. She is genuinely, thoroughly happy, and that is what I wanted for her, and you are the cause of it, and I want you to know I am aware of that." Henry looked at Nellie, who was looking at her father with an expression of complex love. Then he looked back at Elias and said, "She makes me better than I would be without her. I hope you know that too." Elias looked at his daughter and then at the man who had spent 7 years building a life with her, and he nodded the real nod, the full one. "I know," he said. They sat by the fire until the logs burned down to embers, the three of them in the warm room of the house Henry had built on the land he had earned, and the children slept above them, and the Kansas winter moved quietly around the walls, and Nellie sat with her shoulder against her husband's arm and her father's voice going low and easy in the firelight, telling a story about Ohio that she had never heard, and she thought that this was what she would remember when she was old, this specific evening. This exact arrangement of people she loved in the light of a fire, in a house that was home. The years moved with the quality that good years have, quickly and richly, full of the daily material of a life well inhabited. Frank Delaney passed away in the fall of 1890 at the age of 62, leaving a will that increased Henry's share of the operation to 51% and named him the primary operator, which made Henry, at 34, the principal of a substantial cattle operation on the southern Kansas plain. It was not the richest such operation in the territory, and Henry had no particular interest in it becoming so, but it was solid and well-run and fair to the men who worked it, which was the thing Henry cared most about, that it be fair. He gathered the ranch hands the week after Delaney's funeral and told them plainly that the operation would continue as it had, that no man who worked honestly would be losing his position, that wages would be reviewed in the spring, and that the doors of the ranch house were open if any man had a concern he needed to raise. The men listened, and several of them nodded, and one of them, an older hand named Will Greaves, who had been on the ranch since before Henry arrived, said, "Delaney always said you'd be the one to take it on right," and the others nodded at that. Henry thought about Frank Delaney, who had given a traveling cowboy a job and then a chance and then a stake and then an inheritance, and he felt a gratitude that was one of the most complete feelings he had ever experienced. He built a good stone marker for Delaney's grave on the hill at the back of the ranch property, and every spring he made sure someone cleared the grass around it, because it was a small thing and the right thing. Nellie managed the Mercer household with the same capable exactness she brought to everything, and continued her work at the mercantile, which was by 1891 a genuine partnership with her father rather than an act of filial assistance. Elias was 63 and beginning to show, not weakness exactly, but the measured caution of a man who has been pushing hard for 40 years and is starting to choose which hills to climb. He talked to Nellie seriously that year about the future of the store, and she listened seriously, and they arrived at an understanding that the store would pass to her, and that she would manage it with whoever she chose to hire on, which she was already doing, having brought in a capable young man named Edgar Pryor, younger brother of Thomas, who had been their stock boy years before, and trained him in the account keeping and the supply ordering. "You always were the better merchant," Elias said, the echo of what he had said years before, and Nellie said, "I had the better teacher," and Elias looked away at the window and cleared his throat. James Mercer started school in Caldwell in the fall of 1890 at 6 years old, and took to it with the avidity of a child who has been surrounded by books and conversation his entire life, and finally has a dedicated arena for his interests. He came home every afternoon with something new he had learned and required to tell someone about it immediately, and Henry was his preferred audience, sitting at the kitchen table after supper, while James explained things with his father's careful precision and his mother's love of elaboration. Me, who was 3 and not yet in school, listened from the floor where she was usually engaged with some project of her own, absorbing more than she indicated. By the spring of 1892, Nellie was 32, and Henry was 36, and James was 8, and me was 4. And they had been in the house on the 40 acres for 6 years. And the life they had built had the solidity and warmth of something that has been thoroughly inhabited. The house had grown slightly. A room added to the back for the children, and a larger covered porch that Henry built over 2 weekends in the fall, where they spent the long summer evenings, Nellie reading and Henry mending tack or going over the ranch accounts, while the children played in the yard until the light gave out. It was on one of these evenings in the early summer of 1892 that Nellie told Henry she was expecting a third child. He was quiet in the specific way, and then he looked at her with that look that had not changed in 10 years, that unguarded fullness, and he said, "How do you feel?" "Tired," she said honestly. "And glad." "Good," he said. "Both of those are correct," she laughed. "Tired is correct." "Tired means you're paying attention," he said, and leaned over and kissed her temple, gentle and warm. "We have room," he said, meaning the house and also meaning more than the house. "We do," she agreed. Their second daughter was born in February of 1893, a bitter cold February that kept the snow 3 feet deep against the south fence for most of the month, and she arrived on a night so cold the windows frosted on the inside, and Henry kept the fire stoked high enough that the bedroom was warm and orange-lit and close. They named her Ruth, and she was quiet from the beginning, wide-eyed and observant, watching the world from the first with a seriousness that made Nellie and Henry exchange glances and then laugh, because it was so entirely unfamiliar compared to their other two. James was 9 and had opinions about his new sister's name, specifically that it was very short and perhaps she should have a longer name available for occasions. Me was 5 and was interested in Ruth with the focused attention of a scientist examining a new specimen, examining her fingers and toes with the particular severity she brought to things. "She is smaller than a foal," Me said. "Most babies are," Henry said. Me considered this. "That seems inefficient," she said, which was such a distillation of her character at 5 years old that Henry and Nellie had to leave the room to laugh without injury. Elias Quinn met his third grandchild on a Sunday afternoon, driving out to the Mercer place in his wagon, with a basket that contained a carefully wrapped piece of calico fabric, and a jar of preserves, and a small stuffed rabbit that he had bought from the general goods shelf of his own store, which Nellie recognized as the kind of gift-giving that required a man to overcome considerable pride, because buying from your own stock meant admitting you were moved enough to buy a gift at all. He held Ruth as he had held the others, and he was quiet as he had been with the others, and then he said, "She's going to be the thoughtful one." "How do you know?" Nellie asked. "Because she's watching me," he said. "She's watching everything." The others looked at the room. "This one is looking at the people." He was right, as it turned out, because Ruth Mercer grew up to be the reader and the watcher and the one who always knew precisely what was happening in a room before anyone else had quite caught up. The 1890s moved forward in the vast and ordinary way of a good decade, marked not by drama but by the steady accumulation of living. Henry ran the Delaney operation with the thoughtful competence that had always characterized his work, and it grew moderately and sustained well, which was his preferred outcome. He hired fairly and paid fair wages at a time when neither was guaranteed in the cattle business, and the men who worked for him tended to stay, which said something clear about the kind of employer he was. Nellie took over formal management of Quinn's Mercantile in 1894, when Elias, at 66, began having trouble with his heart that the doctor described as not immediately dangerous, but requiring reduced activity. Her father moved to a smaller set of rooms in town and came to the store 3 mornings a week, and then 2 and then 1, and each transition was made easier by the fact that he trusted Nellie completely, had trusted her business judgment for years, and could relinquish control to her without the anxiety that would have accompanied relinquishing it to anyone else. Henry was at her side in all of it, not managing it for her but supporting it, which was the difference that mattered. He fixed the back wall of the store when the boards began to show weather damage. He helped with the twice-yearly inventory. He drove Elias to the store and back when the older man's energy did not permit him to make the walk without fatigue. Elias and Henry had arrived, by the middle of the decade, at a friendship that was its own genuine thing, separate from the fact of Nellie, built on the shared male landscape of work and practicality, and the particular respect between two men who have tested each other and found the other one solid. They played cards on Thursday evenings when Henry came to town for supplies, sitting at Elias' table with coffee, and the sound of their voices going low and easy through those evenings was something Nellie heard when she visited and felt as a particular kind of happiness, two parts of her life in conversation with each other. Elias Quinn died in November of 1896 at the age of 68, in his own bed, with Nellie beside him and Henry standing by the door. He had been ill for several weeks with his heart, not dramatically but in the slow, diminishing way of a body that has given what it came with. He had time to say what he needed to say, which was characteristic of Elias, who believed in order and completion. He told Nellie he was proud of her, which she had known but needed to hear. He told her her mother would have been proud. He told her the store was in good hands and he had never doubted it. He told Henry, on an afternoon a few days before the end when Henry sat with him for an hour while Nellie rested, that he had been wrong about him and he was glad to have been wrong. He said he was glad Nellie had not listened to him in the beginning, though he would never have said so at the time. He said Henry Mercer was a good man and a good father and a good husband, and that was the whole of what a man needed to be. Henry sat with him quietly after that and did not say much, because there was not much to say and Elias had never valued words over the things words point at. He was present, which was what he had always been best at, and which was what was needed. Elias went peacefully in the morning with the November light coming through the window of his room, which was the east window that caught the early light, and he looked, Nellie thought, like a man who had done what he set out to do and found it sufficient. They buried him in the Caldwell cemetery beside Nellie's mother, which was right and proper and what he would have wanted, and the whole of Caldwell came out for it, because Elias Quinn had been the kind of presence in a town that is felt everywhere even by people who never quite knew him. The Reverend spoke well, and several men who had done business with Elias for decades said things afterward that made Nellie understand dimensions of her father she had not fully seen, the generosity he had extended quietly to people in hard years, the credit he had extended without making anyone feel small for needing it, the way he had held the commerce of the town together through 2 bad cattle seasons without calling in debts he could have called in. She stood at the grave in the cold November air with Henry's arm around her and the children beside them, James at 12 already nearly as tall as his mother, me at 9 ferocious in her grief in the full-feeling way she was ferocious in everything, and Ruth at 3 old enough to know that something important had happened and young enough to take her cues from the faces of the people she trusted. Henry held her at the grave and said nothing except her name once, quietly, and that was exactly right. She cried that night in their bedroom, properly, the deep kind, and he held her and let her, not trying to make it shorter or easier, simply present, which was the thing she needed and the thing he had always known how to give. The store became fully hers, and she ran it with the competence she had always had, and the years rolled on in the way years do when they are full of living. James went to study at a college in Lawrence in 1900, at 16, which was young but not impossibly so for a boy of his particular abilities, and the day they put him on the train Henry shook his son's hand and held it, looking at him for a long moment, and Nellie kissed him and told him she expected letters, real letters with complete sentences, and James promised and kept the promise. Me, at 12, decided she wanted to learn to ride properly, meaning not side saddle but properly, which caused a certain amount of commentary in Caldwell in 1901, but Henry taught her without reservation, saying privately to Nellie that me was going to do exactly what me decided to do, and the only question was whether she learned correctly, and Nellie agreed completely. Me learned with the fearless efficiency she brought to everything, and within a year was a better rider than most of the boys in Caldwell, a fact she did not advertise because she was not interested in other people's opinions, which was another Mercer quality. Ruth, the watcher, grew up to be the reader that Elias had predicted, spending her afternoons in the Caldwell library after school and developing an opinion about every book she read that she was not shy about sharing. She was 11 in 1904 and had the particular quality of a child who is going to be formidable in a way that will eventually become apparent to everyone, though it is perhaps not fully apparent yet. Henry turned 50 in 1906, and Nellie organized a gathering at the Mercer house that was not quite a party, but was not quite not a party either, with the Delaney Ranch hands and the neighboring families and Clara Webb and her husband and several people from town, and food that Nellie and me and Ruth had been preparing for 2 days, and an atmosphere that felt to Henry, who was not entirely comfortable being the center of attention, like being held by something warm. He stood on the back porch in the October evening with the creek willows dark against the sky and the sound of conversation and laughter from inside the house, and Nellie came and stood beside him, and he put his arm around her. 50, he said. You don't look it, she said, which was a slight exaggeration because he had silver in his hair now and the lines around his eyes were permanent. But the eyes themselves were the same, that river gray blue, and the posture was the same, that easy settled stillness. You're being kind, he said. I'm being accurate, she said, which was closer to true, because Henry Mercer at 50 had the look of a man who had been made well and maintained carefully and was still very much in his prime. 24 years, he said, she thought back. They had met in 1882, she was now 46. Yes, she said. Any regrets? He said, and there was a small smile in it, a deliberate echo of something they had both always known the answer to. Let me think, she said, with the same small smile. She pretended to consider. He waited with the patience that had never left him. No, she said, not one. He pulled her closer and she rested against his side, looking out at the land they had built together in the dark, the paddock fence and the barn and the garden and the cottonwoods at the creek edge, 40 acres that were nothing when he had stood here the first time, and were now so thoroughly alive with the life they had made. I told you I would spend every day earning it, he said. You did, have I? He asked, and it was a genuine question, asked in the genuine way of a man who does not take things for granted even after a quarter century. She turned to look at him in the lamplight falling from the window. She saw the silver in his hair and the lines on his face, and the hand she had held through every year of her adult life, and the eyes that had looked at her straight from the first moment, and had never looked at her any other way. Henry Mercer, she said, you have spent every day of 24 years being the finest thing that ever happened to me. If you ask me that again, I will be forced to remind you of every specific instance, and we will be out here until morning. He laughed the full laugh, and she felt it the same way she had felt it the first time he laughed in the mercantile, like something opening. I love you, he said. It was not something he said extravagantly or constantly, which made it mean more every time it landed. I love you, she said back, also not extravagantly, also meaning all of it. They stood on the back porch of the house he had built on the land they had earned together in the state of Kansas in the year 1906, with their children grown and their work well done, and their life settled into the full and final shape of what it had been becoming all along. And the stars came out over the plains in the way they always did in that country, enormous and brilliant and very close. And Nellie Quinn Mercer thought that if she had to choose a single moment to stand in forever it might be this one, though she knew that could not be right, because there had been so many moments worth standing in, and there would be more, and that was the finest thing she could say about any life. Inside the house their daughter Me was making everyone laugh at something, the laugh carrying clearly through the window, and Ruth's quieter voice was asking a question of someone. and somewhere in the kitchen someone was singing, and the lamplight fell gold and warm across the porch boards, and Henry Mercer put his face against his wife's hair and held on, and Nellie held on back, and the vast and generous Kansas night settled around them like something given. James came home from Lawrence the following summer with his degree and a letter of acceptance from a law firm in Wichita, and Henry shook his hand again at the station, and this time the handshake held for longer, father and son, the same gray-blue eyes looking at each other with everything that did not need saying. Nellie held her boy for a long moment and told him she was proud, and James said, "I learned it from watching you both," and it was the finest thing he had ever said. Me, at 18 in 1901, and now 24 in 1907, had by that year established herself as the person who ran the Mercer household's practical affairs with a ferocious efficiency that had inspired several of the neighboring families to seek her advice on matters of organization and management. She had also been courted in the careful Kansas way by a young farmer named Daniel Cole, who had the good sense to approach Henry directly and the better sense to approach me with complete honesty about what he was and what he had, which me respected above all other qualities. They were married in the autumn of 1907 in a ceremony in Caldwell that was, by general agreement, one of the finest the town had seen in years, and me was radiant in the specific way of a woman who has chosen exactly what she wanted and is not surprised by her own happiness. Ruth completed her schooling in Caldwell in 1907 at 14 and had 4 more years of growing before the wider world would see what Nellie and Henry already knew about their youngest, which was that she was going to do something that mattered in a way that had not yet revealed its shape, and that when it did, it was going to be remarkable. Henry Mercer and Nellie Quinn Mercer sat on the front porch of their house on the last evening of 1907 in the December cold, wrapped in blankets, watching the last of the year go out over the Kansas plain. The children were scattered and well. The ranch was solid and good. The mercantile was managed and thriving. The house was warm behind them. The stars were out in their full winter abundance, sharp and brilliant and very close. "New Year tomorrow," Nellie said. "Yes," Henry said. "What do you want from it?" He considered this with his customary seriousness. "The same thing I want from every year," he said. "More of this." She looked at him. "This being what exactly?" He looked at the stars and then at her. "You," he said. "Here, whatever comes." She settled closer against his side under the shared blanket in the cold, clear night at the end of 25 years of a life that had been built one honest day at a time by 2 people who had understood from the beginning, even when everything was uncertain, that what they were building was worth the work. "Then you'll have it," she said. "You'll have it every year I have to give." He covered her hand with his, the one with the small garnet ring, warm against the cold, and she felt it as she always had and always would as the most settled, the most certain, the most completely right thing she had ever known. The stars blazed overhead over the plains of Kansas, enormous and unhurried and ancient beyond counting, and below them Henry and Nellie Mercer sat together on the porch of the house they had built on the land they had earned, surrounded by the life they had made. And the new year came toward them across the dark and generous country like something they had always been waiting for, and they were ready, and they were glad, and they were home.